This is episode 5 of the Mitsubishi Challenger video series, and today I'm going to put this carburetor that I rebuilt on the last video back on the car and see if it works. So I got this put back in here. I don't have any vacuum lines or anything like that hooked up to it right now. I just want to see if it'll run with gas in the throat of it. That way we know where we've left off. I have the solenoid hooked up, not that that's going to do anything if I'm just putting gas down the throat of it. And the key is on, which means we should have ignition power. Let's give it a little drink here and just make sure that nothing else has gone wrong on it. Beautiful. All right, let's try filling up the float bowl. Okay, I can see in the sight glass, I'm not sure if I'm getting it on camera or not, where gas is filling up in the bowl. Okay, yeah, there it is. It's probably too much, but all right, as we can see, hopefully we've got gas in the float bowl, so let's crank it. That was anticlimactic. All right, let's see if that accelerator pump works. Oh, damn throttle was stuck closed. I guess it was hitting the gasket or something. Now that that's free, maybe it'll run. Or maybe not. Give it a little bit of help. That was unexpected. I expected a bit more than this. Here's where we are. You can see on the sight glass there, the fuel that's in the bowl has not left. It hasn't leaked out. It hasn't been pulled out by the Venturi effect. It just isn't going anywhere. So something is wrong internally in the carburetor. At this point, I think I'm just going to have to take this carburetor off once again, fix this linkage, and then probably take the top of it off and see what is going on in that bowl and why gas isn't getting out of there to anywhere, because this thing is almost like a hard stop. It's almost like this solenoid is disengaged or isn't hooked up, but I mean, I hear it, I know it is. So let me get this thing off once again, get it apart, see what's going on. I've got this carburetor apart once again, and I already sent it through the parts washer again. Let me see if I can get a good angle on this. Apologize for it being in the sun here, but I sent this through the ultrasonic cleaner for another half hour after letting it soak while it warmed up for probably an hour. There was a lot of crap still in here whenever I put it in, but as you can see, this is pretty damn clean. I went through and kind of blew compressed air through everything. You know, I didn't see anything that even remotely looked like a blockage. I'm going to go ahead and put it back together and get it on the car. I've got the carburetor put back on. I tried to cap off all of the manifold vacuum connections that weren't going to anything. The only thing that I have is this one, which goes to the vacuum advance. I need to get a new hose, but that should work for now. This is some sort of altitude switching valve. That's an input, not a vacuum source. I'm not worried about that. I put some fuel in the bowl already. Ignition is on. So let's see what happens. I say the ignition is on. Let's just squirt some there, and maybe that just needs to prime it. Okay. Almost. It'll run whenever I choke it, but not very well. Wow, this spit out a lot of junk. Well, that's one way to find a coolant leak. That burned the crap out of me. So it's been 5 days and things are healing up nicely. I was thinking about what happened and reviewing the footage and everything. This hose had never leaked before whenever I was working on it. And I thought, well, maybe it had gotten warm enough to where the thermostat opened up, and that's why coolant was directed here and sprayed me in the hand. But I'm noticing that even now, it's just slowly trickling out of there, which, again, it never did before, even whenever it was running. So I guess there was a blockage or something in this hose, maybe a dirt dauber nest or whatever. And then once I revved it up and it got enough pressure, it disintegrated that, blew it out, and then that's why coolant went everywhere. Won't be doing that again. But this connects, it's supposed to connect to the auto choke, and then I guess this is the return for that coolant passage. Anyway, getting back to the problem at hand, which is probably not the best choice of words, but this thing would not run really at all without covering it up with my hand. So it needs a choke, and then I've got to connect this linkage up back to the gas pedal because I will be revving it from inside the vehicle from this point on. Anyway, I need to get the carburetor off again, and then hook up the choke, and then we'll try it again. This is the old carburetor, and I do not remember if it's the original one from the Challenger here, or if it's the one from the Sapporo, but it has a different auto choke assembly than that remanufactured carburetor came with. So what I'm going to try to do is pull this off and see if there's any hope for it, and then put it in the cleaner, see how it comes out, and then I might be able to bolt that on to the new carburetor and get auto choke back, and you can see that, you know, this was the coolant line that went to the one that squirted everywhere, and then the return of that goes back down here, which is where I have that just capped off with a bolt on the new one. And then there's a coolant passage here on the intake manifold that returns to. Okay, so coolant flows in this area here, and that heats up this cavity, which causes this bimetallic spring to move. The tension on it is controlled by probably a setting there. So either this is turned directly and it twists that, or this is a cap and there's a screw underneath there to do that. Of course, this is the adjustment for the fast idle. So whenever your whole choke plate closes, it'll put this stop there, and then that'll prevent the throttle from closing all the way, because turning it counterclockwise, looking at this, closes it. So yeah, this is fast idle. There we go. All right, well, better than it was. Okay. Let's try and remember how this goes back together. So the choke butterfly is actually bigger on that other carburetor. So that won't fit in there. Well, I think that's going to do it for now. I'm going to slam it back on the car and see if that made any difference at all. Got the carburetor back on the vehicle. I have the coolant lines hooked up the way they're supposed to be. Hopefully it doesn't leak. I think I have all of the linkage set up, so let's give this thing some, prime it up a little bit, fill up the bowl as best we can. Okay, I adjusted the auto choke where it's about half choked now. Let's see if that made any difference. Well, I guess we've gone one step forward and two steps back. This thing just isn't running right at all. I adjusted to have the choke on. It seemed to start, then it died. Then the float bowl filled all the way up, like the needle wasn't working. But then even with the float bowl full, still wouldn't run right. So I hooked the internal starter switch back up, got in there, gave it the gas, started, and then it ran, but it ran like something would run whenever you're choking it to death. Just real hard, a lot of fuel consumption, and a little bit of backfiring. So it seemed like the choke was on too much. So I adjusted it to take the choke off, and then it just would run a little bit and quit. So, and the same thing with it didn't seem to make any difference how much fuel was in the float bowl. But then if I squirt gas in it, it will run a little bit, but it still runs like crap. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. Well, it's the next day, and I've had a little bit of time to think about this, and we've got several problems here. One is where the fuel is at right now, which is kind of hard to see, especially with the sun and everything. Right there at that dot, that's where it's supposed to be. So whenever the fuel pump was running and it was full, that's problem number one. And I think what it was doing is, after filling up there, it was going out the vents and getting into the airstream somehow and making way too rich of a mixture. Second problem is there's got to be something wrong with the idle passages, and I think the only reason that it ran whenever I put the rag over the top of it is because that was then building enough vacuum in there to suck fuel through the main jets, which that seems to work, but it doesn't work reliably with too much fuel in here. So that's why whenever I even had it on choke, it wasn't running right at all and consuming way too much fuel. So we've got to clean out those idle circuits. I did take out I think this is the idle mixture screw. It was in about 2 7/8 turns, so I'm going to remember that. And like smaller carburetors, these are called emulsion tubes. This was on the secondary side. It looks pretty nice, but there was a whole bunch of crud there on the end. And then this that looks like somebody hacked at it a bit, that was on the main side. That's the main emulsion tube that didn't have quite the crap in it. And then I've got 2 more needle screws here that I'm going to take out and make a note of how far they were in. One of them, I think, is part of the idle circuit. And then, of course, back where that, I guess, emulsion tube was, a bunch of crap in there. So I guess this thing didn't get as clean as I thought it was there in the beginning. This is 1. It stops there. I want to say 1.25, maybe a little less. Whatever this is, it's all the way in. It is bottomed out. There we go. And then I'll try and start it while giving it the gas. It may not start now, but we can try. Yeah, I suspected as much. Cold start next day. As we can see, the choke is on. It had a little bit of fuel that was left in the fuel pump that made it into the bowl of the carburetor and started it, fired right off. I still can't tell if it's actually using the idle circuits, if they're plugged up or whatever. So what I did is this idle mix screw at the bottom, as well as the idle bypass, which is right underneath this solenoid. I screwed all those all the way in. And powering down the solenoid means that the entire idle circuits on this thing are closed off. So I'm going to try and start it again. If it runs the same way, then we know something is not right, plugged up. If it runs differently, then at least we know the idle circuits are working and we can work on the choke or whatever else is going on here. So let's give it a start. Yep, that should not be running with no idle. So the choke being on is pulling fuel straight from the main jets. With no choke, it's never going to run at all because the idle circuits simply aren't working. So we have a few problems we need to solve here. One of them is why this thing won't run unless it's choked, just at all. It just doesn't even idle. And already set, this is the idle mixture screw. This is, let me get something better to point with here. Idle mix. These you're not supposed to touch. This one is idle bypass. I'm not really sure what that means. This is another needle jet that was, or needle valve or whatever, that was all the way closed. It goes kind of halfway in here. I'm not entirely sure what that would even do, but that's not a factor. But this is in the idle path. The solenoid is in the idle path. This is the final stop on the idle path. With all three of these closed, it made no difference in the car running. So something is stopped up after this solenoid. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is basically whenever there's anything more than gravity pressure on this, on the float, it just allows more fuel to enter and floods out the carburetor. So problem number three is I'm going to get rid of the automatic choke. I've got a manual choke kit. And then problem number four is some of these things on here are likely getting vacuum leaks. Some of them we tried to bypass, like this is some sort of air switching valve or whatever, but we're going to try and get rid of this crap that really now serves no purpose. So this should go to this primary pilot jet. Okay, well that side's not stopped up. That's working. Is this solenoid messed up? So that's working. Yep, that's just open. This thing connects right to passages that we're working on here into the idle circuit. Okay, so I read in the service manual how this is supposed to work. So this passage here, which goes to the center, which is this one, is what's referred to as the slow passage, which is right here, which goes into the idle circuit. If this is open, exposed to air, it effectively kills the idle circuit. There's no fuel will go through there if that is open to air. So this is mounted on here like so, and that comes out and that's here, and it has this little stopper on it that opens and closes. So whenever it's closed, this rubber is over that and it seals it off. Idle circuit works as it should. If this is open, it goes to this other side, which goes straight to the bowl vent. I mean, that's vented straight to air. And it has two actuators for this to open the valve. I guess normally it should be closed because there will be slight vacuum on here as the idle circuit is working, so it'll pull this valve closed. However, there's two vacuum passages. There's this one on the outside, which we saw, and then there's another one internal that goes, I think it's this one, that goes into ported vacuum. So whenever that acts on it, it'll pull this out in a form of vacuum in the chamber here and pull this out. Now, if this is just nothing's connected to it, and that will be at atmosphere, and that vacuum won't work, but we'll have a vacuum leak on that. And this is supposed to go to some other solenoid or whatever, to where if it has vacuum on it, then this would work normally and open. If it doesn't have any vacuum on it, it should be closed. I may have that backwards. But regardless of all that, this is just not needed. So, a couple of ways we can do this, since I do want to cap all this stuff off, is we could put a heavy spring in there so it always pushes, and it may be missing a spring. That may be part of the problem. In fact, if it doesn't have a spring in there at all, then we'll put a heavy spring on it that way, that, and then cap that off, and then that should keep it closed, and that should fix our idle circuit. Actually, that may be what the doctor ordered. Could it be that simple? Just missing a spring? I bet we left that spring out, and that's been the problem all along. Wow. So I was watching Watch Wes work earlier, and he was working on a quadrajet out of a small block Chevy, and he says a carburetor job isn't good unless you rebuild it at least twice, because you've done something stupid like me. Okay, so moving on to problem 2, which was the float. So what I ended up doing here was bending the tang on the float so it keeps the proper fuel level. That's about 30 pounds. Reasonable attempt at problem number 2. So then the last thing is problem number 3, which is the converting the choke to manual. All right, let's try that. Hey, that I killed the idle solenoid, and that killed the engine just then, so that might actually be working on idle. Perfect, idle's working. So the idle problem is solved. The choke problem I just have to hook up the choke wire. It's working good. I did get the float to work and actually cut off the fuel flow and not flood the carburetor. I've got to adjust that a little bit more. And at this point, normally I would show a video of the engine running, let y'all hear it for a few minutes. Unfortunately, I figured out what that squeaking noise was. So pay attention to the number 2 exhaust valve whenever I actually crank this thing. Yeah, so I'm going to have to leave you guys a little bit of a cliffhanger while I figure out what that is and put it on the next video. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I do apologize for taking so long to get these videos edited. I actually have a lot of footage from the Jimmy and All Red and a few other things, and I hope to get those videos out soon, so please subscribe if you haven't already done so.